You're calling it a sine function, a cosine function. You can write different things for this. Guys, I would call this first one a sine function because it starts right at the origin. It's in the middle of a cycle on the way up. That's one complete cycle there, so you have to kind of look at this when you're writing the equation. It has been compressed. Let's try drawing that again. Think about how much it's been compressed. If you guys could stop talking, that would be wonderful. It's been compressed. Normally it would be, well, that's a pretty bad graph, but normally it would look like that, right? I should have started with the bigger one. It's been compressed from 2 pi down to here. If you want to tell how much it's been compressed, just count how many cycles are in 2 pi. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, and there's 4. There are 4 cycles in 2 pi. The value that you put in this equation here is 4. It's been compressed by a factor of 4 because there's 4 cycles in 2 pi. Then this number is the number of cycles that are in 2 pi. Because normally there's 1 cycle in 2 pi. Right? When you just have sine of 1x or just sine of x, there's 1 cycle in 2 pi. If you put another number like a 4, it makes 4 cycles in 2 pi now. It compresses it, right? Then you also have to account for the fact that it's taller than normal. It's 3 each way. The amplitude is 3. That's been expanded by a factor of 3. It hasn't been shifted side to side, so there's no phase shift. It hasn't been shifted up and down. There's no vertical displacement. If you did want to write a cosine one, what you would have to do is look at a different place as the starting point. You'd have to say, look at that as the starting point. The period's going to be the same. It's not going to change the period. The period is still pi over 2. It means there's a 4 here. Sorry if I'm writing cosine. If you're putting cosine here, it's still going to be cos 4x. Except that we're going to need to do a phase shift here. How far has that been shifted? Normally the graph without a shift would be right here. It's been shifted to the right. 1 square. 1 square on here. Pi is 8 squares. 1 square is pi over 8. So you could say minus pi over 8 if you want to do that phase shift. If you do want to use cosine, this is the simplest equation because it doesn't involve a phase shift. Just to use sine. If you want to do the other one, find a place where it's starting and decide what you're going to call it. If you're going to call this one sine, you got to look for a place in the center where it starts going up, and then you got to find the same place again. That is, how much is that? It's 1 pi, right? The period equals pi, 1 pi. It has been compressed. Normally it looks like, normally it's this far, right? Normally it's that far. The period has been compressed from there to there, right? Period's been cut in half. The period's been cut in half. It means that you need to change this from sine x to sine of 2x. We also need a phase shift though, so I'm going to leave that bracket like that for a second. If you want, you can put another set of brackets there to keep that organized. And then we need a 4 out in front of it here because the amplitude has changed. To figure out the phase shift, think about how much it's shifted from where it would be without a phase shift. Without a phase shift, that cycle would start right there, right? Without a phase shift, it would start right there. It's been shifted how much to the right? How many squares? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's been shifted 4 squares to the right. You don't just put minus 4 because 1 square is not 1 here. You figure out how much 1 square is, or you figure out how much 4 squares is. Pi is 12 squares, right? Pi is 12 squares. So how much is 4 squares then? 4 squares out of 12 squares, pi. That's what it is, right? 4 out of 12 squares. Or in other words, so you could write 4 pi over 12, or you could reduce that and make it pi over 3. That's one possible phase shift there. The other thing you could call it a cosine curve if you want. If you were going to call it a cosine curve, I'm going to get rid of this. Cosine starts at a maximum. You could start it there if you're calling it cosine. Okay, you could start right there. I might actually start it here and call it negative cosine. When it starts at the bottom like that, you could call it a negative cosine curve, and then it's just one square. If I'm writing a negative cosine equation, I write negative 4 cos. All of this is the same, 2. The only difference is this phase shift here. What's the phase shift going to be if it's negative cosine, starting as though it starts here? 1 square to the right, minus 1 pi over 12. Okay, you could do that. If you change it from a cosine to a sine or to a negative sine or negative cosine, the only thing that changes is this phase shift. Everything else is the same. Hopefully you've managed to do some of this. I gave you guys a little shortcut for some of these things for these, because most of you are okay when you can just think of what's happening here. Like if there's an 8 in here, you've compressed it down times 8. Like you've divided it by 8. Normally the period is 2 pi. If you have an 8 there, then you're going to divide it by 8, right? You take the period and cut it up into 8. So it's 2 pi over 8 or pi over 4. You can just take 2 pi and divide it by that b value, and that gives you the period. This might be a little kind of thing to understand. That's what you're doing here, even if you didn't realize this little formula. Because remembering it as a little formula might help when it's a weird number like this or like this. If it's a number you can work with, 8, thinking, well, I compress it by 8, so normally it's 2 pi, so it's going to be pi over 4. You can sub numbers in there for the period and for that b value. If this is a 6 here, normally the period is 2 pi. It's just going to be divided by 6, or pi over 3. It's using this idea here. If you have a weird number here, just do the same thing here. 2 pi divided by b. 2 pi divided by 8 fifths. 2 pi divided by 8 fifths. Do you remember from grade 8 how to divide by a fraction? 2 pi, something divided by a fraction is the same as 2 pi times its reciprocal, right? Dividing by 8 fifths is like multiplying by 5 eighths. This is 10 pi over 8, or in lowest terms, 5 pi over 4. You have to think that 2 pi, the normal period, divided by that number is what happens to the period. All right? You can use it, work backwards. You can take this formula and work backwards for these.
Announcement in 1.5 minutes.
Sub in the numbers. You can rearrange this. 2 pi divided by b is the period. You could switch this around, right? You know that any formula that looks like that, x divided by y equals z. If you have a formula like that, you could move this y over to the top on the other side. You could move this z down to the bottom over here. You could do the same thing with this, right? You can rearrange this formula and you can say the b value times the period, b value times the period has to equal 2 pi. Whatever's here and whatever the period is, those two things have to multiply to give you 2 pi. Or you could put this on the bottom here now. You can move this down here and say, to get my b value, I got to go 2 pi divided by the period. If you're going to kind of memorize these sorts of things, make sure you understand. All right? We're going to look at the second part of 4.2 after, and I'm going to give you a pretest right now.